Good evening. My name is Joseph Khalil, and this is my demonstration for the small project for the Object-Oriented Development class for semester spring 2018. Starting off, this project requires the use of the MVC Model View Controller to create a small program for a small library that will help lend books to clients. And the project requires the presence of three separate uh, files to store the information, and those files are going to be books, clients, and lending info. Now, the the requirements for the project requires the use of MVC and to store each file in certain format. For example, the client text have to be stored as a client ID, name, and deleted. Whereas deleted is if it's just a flag, so we don't really delete the record of the client. We just flag it with 1, as that means the client is logically deleted. And if it's 0, the client is not deleted. As for the books, if it's going to have a book ID, book title, and length, whereas length is similar to deleted. If it's 1, it means the book is length. If it's 0, the book is not length. It's available to be length. And finally, there's the lending info, where we have a borrow ID, client ID, book ID, which are both pulled from the previous ones. Date out, that's the day we issue the book. Date in is the whenever the book is returned, and the fine amount. And now there is explanation for the fine amount. For the fine, there has to be certain calculations for any if the duration exceeds a certain amount of time, the calculation changes. Now, starting off, what I did is I have, if you can see on the side here, I have 4 separate packages. The first package is for the books, which also utilizes the Model View Controller. I'm going to show them individually. As for we have the book model, book controller, and the book view, and each one of them have a reference for the other classes. As for the book controller, what we're trying to achieve from the book, we need the ability to add a new book. Where adding a new book will prompt the model to update the list. The concept of the way this program works is that we have a text file and we have an array list that contains strings, and each string will have a reference for that book, the way it's stored in the text file. So once we want to add a new book, it takes book ID number, which is an integer, and a book name. Once we call this method the controller, it calls out from the model to update the book list. What it means is that it's going to clean the update book list. What the update book list does is that it calls for the file to list method, which in return it clears the array list we have in the system, and then it sets the file location. And then once it clears the system, and then what it does is that it pulls from the file location here, and then afterward what it does is that it reads through the file that we have stored in this location, and it retrieves the volume, and it parses through the values that what that is stored in the text file, and add those information to the list that we have. Once once we're done updating the book list, which is a list of that contains the reference for all the books stored in the format of book ID, book name, and if it's lent or not. Then we set the book ID, and also we set the name to lowercase just to avoid any conflict. And since it's a new book, so the length is going to be set to 0 by default. Now we have to add the book to the list in a certain format. And once we do that, we store the book to the file again, which calls out on the model to store the book to the file. And as you can see, when we need to write to the file, it actually calls out when we store the book to the file, it writes to file. Literally, it parses through the book list and it writes the values to the file. And as you can see, this is the file location that we will assign at the beginning. This is just for me to remember. When we start our program, it's going to prompt the user to assign the file location. The other method is going to be lending a book. So once we lend the controller, it prompts at the book controller we have a method that calls for the lend a book. It also takes a book ID number. And just for the record, book IDs, client ID and borrow ID are all auto-generated through a method in the menu MDC. So when it calls out to lend a book, what it does is update the list again, and then the information we inputted, it gets written to it updates what it does, it parses through the string that is it parses through the string. For example, we entered we want to lend the book with the book ID. So what it does, it pulls the book from the list, iterates over the updated book list, and then it changes the substring at the end of the book of that string, which is, if we look at it here, for example, this last book, I'm going to do it here. So this is our book ID, the book name, and this is the last part. So once iterates over the list of those values, it pulls this string, which is a value inside that list, and it changes this last value from 0 to 1. And that signals that the book is currently lent. Also, we have to return a book, so it just does the opposite of renting a book. So it just parses through the string, and then it turns the value of 1 at the end of that string to 0. Also, we have display all books method, which is just parses through the list and display all the books. Also, we have display lent books, so it only display lent books. Now, as for and also display rented books, which return books, which displays only the books that are not being rented. And also, The display all books, it shows the lent books at the beginning and then followed by the non-rented books. We will display those over the user right now. So for okay, so we started the code and it prompted us right away to enter the client file location. I have them stored here just for simplicity. This is where the client's file is going to be stored. We just have to enter the link or the URL for the file. And the last one is going to be where the lending info is going to be stored. Now, as you can tell, the first method is display lent books. So it went display lent books. So I'm going to okay. So what it did is that it went through this list, and at the beginning it only showed the 1308 and 1372. These are the books that are being lent right now, so they got displayed at first, and then it showed us the list of books that are all books that currently lent to clients. So it showed the list of all books that are currently lent, those two, and then it showed us that the list of all books that are currently available on hand, which is what's left. So at the beginning it showed displayed the lent books only, those two books. Display all books, all of them. And then at the end what we did is that book controller add new book. So what it does is that it takes a model. It has to generate the book ID and a book name. And now when we generate the book ID, store here, the way that it's going to be a 4-digit number, so that being a small library, so I assume 4-digit number should be enough for IDs. It could be adjusted easily to create larger IDs. Now to add, let's say we want to add a new book. So the last book we had was the Python, at first Python. Oh, sorry, Networking Plus. So let's say we want to add a new book. Let's call it new book. Again, we have to select the file locations. Then I forgot to remove these. So what it did is that it added the new book, and if we open the file, you can see that it added a new book over here, and it has 0. So moving on to the next one. As for the clients, we did something similar. I used the MVC. As you can tell, we have client model. Thank you. Now, as for back to the book, my apologies, back to the book. The way we displayed the results is through the view class, which was connected through the model, the book model. And as you can tell here, it pulled the results from the book and from the book model for the display. Now for the client, we had the client controller where we had the option to create a client. So if we're creating a client, similar process, we update the list, client list, we set the ID, the client ID, client name, and by default the client is not deleted, it's 0. Then we add the client to the list, and we store that client to files. So, and they're all refer to methods here in the model. And then we have the other option of deleting a client. Deleting a client is very similar to renting a book. So it parses through the client list, which is pulled from here. And what it does is it parses through the string and it changes this number 0 to 1. So we can test this one. Let's try to test this one. So let's create a client. And we call the client John Doe. And just to make sure we have no John Doe stored here. Okay. So we create the client. So let's test this one. So we want to create a client. We generate the client ID. And we call our client John Doe. And let's test it. The file location again. And let's see if it added the client here. There we go. It added the client and it has the value equals 0 by default. Okay, let's see if we want to delete the client. Let's hope that works. Again, we have to enter those info. The reason I didn't create an interactive menu because this will allow the just in case I will be working later on creating a graphical user interface, and this will allow me to, so I don't have to keep deleting, I just go create a graphical user interface and just pull all the methods needed from those MVCs. And if you can see, it prompted me the client John Doe got deleted. So let's check. There you go. Got deleted. Now, and for displaying the, you can tell for displaying all the clients we have and display for any other method, if we have the client view class that is pulling these information needed from the client model. Also, now we have the lending info. So for the lending info, we have the controller, which allows us to lend a book and return a book, pretty much. And also, there's a method for setting lending info file location, because just another method so to set the file location, which we'll get prompted for at the beginning. So we have another method called calculate find, which we'll explain in a second. We have print date, which gives us a timestamp or date stamp, to be more accurate, current date stamp and the format month, day, and year. So starting with lending book. So the lending controller takes lending model, lending view, client controller, and book controller as parameters. The reason being is because we need reference to all those during the process. So when we lend a book, what it does is it updates the same process like the other to update the list that we have with the most current values from the client file, from the lending info file. And then we set a borrow ID. Now as for the borrow ID, again, it's auto-generated in the menu method. And then we set client ID, book ID. Those three are auto-generated. And then when we need to set the lend date when we're lending the book. Now since we're lending a book, that means the return date is 0 because it's empty. So I've opted to put a 0 value for it. And the fine is equal to 0 at this point. Now just to clarify things, the way the file, the lending info is set up, we have borrow ID, we have client ID, book ID, and date, return date, fine. Now the first one is 4 digits, second one is 4 digits, third one is 4 digits. The lend date is in the format of month, day, and year. Now when it's being if we're lending a book, the first values are going to be 0, 0. Now when we return a book, these values become something similar with this format. I have month, date, and then at the return value month, day, year. Sorry. And whatever that value for the fine that gets calculated. Now, with that said, we lend the book. Once we get all those values, we add the book to the lending list, insert a format, and then we store that list into the file again. Now, vice versa, when we return a book, what it does is it asks, when we need to return the book, we ask for the return ID. Using that return ID, first of all, we auto-generate the return date. And the reason we do that using this method is that it doesn't allow for human error. So basically, if it auto calculates as of 11:15 on that same day the amount of days, and it rounds the month to 30 days a month, not 31. So we print, it gives us a date stamp, and then we start by, we update the lending list. Now we also update our lending info, which is the string over here. Now this lending info is, what it does is it search that list using the borrow ID. Let me show you. So it searched the list through the borrow ID, and it returns like a string that's a representation of what the value present inside the lending info. An example, it will return this value. So if we search 1113, let's try it. So the return, it searched 11. For example, we search for the value 1113. It searched. This is the borrow ID. It searched the lending info for 1113, and it returns a string that is a representation of those values from 1113 all the way to 0. And from that string, it pulls all the necessary information. It pulls our client ID from that string. It also generates the client name from that client ID, if you can tell, and also the book ID, and it generates the book name from that book ID. And then the lending date. The lending date is also generated from that same string that we pulled, which is lending info. And then as for the fine amount, it's a method that calculates the fine based on the lending date and the return date. And if we can see the calculate fine method in the model, the lending model. It converts the dates into a certain format, and it calculates how many years there is, how many months, and how many days, and it calculates the whole rent period into days. And then if the rent period we have, the way it was explained, the client will have 14 days. If he returned that book within 24 hours after that 14 days, the fine is 0. If he returned it within 24 to 48 hours after that 15 days, the fine is $1. And if he returned it any day after that, the fine is going to be that $1 because it's already calculated, and then that renting period minus 18 days. The reason is 18 days because we already have the 15 days for the first period and then 18 for the second period. And then once it does calculate when it calculates the fine, it does return book. When the method that we explained a while ago, it changes the value from 1 to 0, and then we have also the return book. It's in the lending, and what it does is it changes the value, this value, from 00, this value from 00, and this will become the the date of the return and the amount of fine. Now we can test this one. So we do, I have it here in the menu controller, start the program, at lend book. Let's do this real quick. We're going to lend the book, so we create the client name. Let's give it a name. Donnie Yen, my favorite actor. And the book name is, let's give it a name, Test Book, just for the heck of it. So this book was lent and was added to the file. So if we can test it real quick, and it shows that, first of all, lending info, so we can compare it, books and clients. And if we can see the last one here, running in. Okay, so we'll start here. We have the last if we take a look at this value, so what it did is, this is the new borrow ID, and this is the client ID over here, Donnie Yen. It's new client, so it's not deleted, so 0. And then the book ID, which is 1156, it's called test book, and 1, of course, because it's lent. And you can tell that it got rented today at 5/13/2018, so the return date is 0 and the fine is 0. So I'm going to remember that number, 1820. So just to test this method, so 1820. Here we're going to return the book. Let's find that return the borrow ID. It was 1820, so 1820. So if we open the file, and if we can tell, the 1820, return date is 5/13/18, and the fine is 0 because it's within the same day. So we're able to create new clients, add new books, return books, updating the lending info, and at the same time I use the MVC separately for each package, so that each model or each controller and model and view is only responsible for one task, which is either handling the book info, the client's info, or the lending info. And then the menu itself to control those three packages is also an MVC that allows to control, like for example, when we start the program, and then we have starting the program to ask us for the input, the file location, and then lending book. When we lend a book or return a book, it prompts and it's asked like for in the model. You can tell the lend book at the model it calls for all the other uh, methods from the client lending controller, client controller, and book controller to achieve the task needed, and the same thing for the return book. And then it has the user, which is the main method that allows us to actually call for all those. We have to instantiate instances of those classes so we can get this going. Thank you for watching.